The two of us rode Cuteness together.
Or it rode us, virtually at first, then actually.
Cute teaches you what it means to traverse and be traversed. We surrendered. We softened. We became rubberized and plushy, spring-loaded and squishable.
Cute made us pliable with the promise of unknown pleasures, lured us with glimpses of a different meltdown in which, instead of portentous historical singularity and apocalypse, soft thresholds are continually dissolved by currents of joyful abandon. All that is serious melts into cute, because popping bubbles is the purest delight. In the beginning, Cuteness served as a frivolous deflation of the macho, grim, bossy, self-important rhetoric of contemporary accelerationism, left and right alike, and as a superficial joke to mask passions whose irresistible pull invited the relinquishing of all caution and the disarming of all ego defense.
Was all that dark posturing just another way of stopping things from happening?
What if we let go?
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without option anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Today, Taylor and I are very excited to bring you Amy Ireland and Maya B. Kronic. Amy is a theorist and experimental writer based in Melbourne, Australia. Her research focuses on questions of agency and technology and modernity, and she is a member of the techno-materialist trans-feminist collective Laboria Cuboniks. Awesome name. Maya B. Kronic is a philosopher and head of research and development at the publisher Urbanomic, which aims to engender interdisciplinary thinking and production, the agent, patient, and product of ongoing research project on gender hyperstition and cute accelerationism. But a very cute welcome to you both. I'm so stoked to be able to talk to you. This is years in the making, so just got to get that out of the way.
Thanks for inviting us on.
We'd like to start out giving our guests the opportunity to share we call it kind of an origin story, maybe an intensive moment, encounter, text, thinker, etc., that sparked a passion for philosophy, theory. And then if you want to take that into the direction of the origin of this text itself, that would be great. And whoever wants to start, or, feel free to share whatever you feel, even if it's nothing.
I'm not really sure whether I'm a philosopher. I remember there was a particular point when I just decided I'm going to call myself a philosopher, but it was more as a joke than anything else. Because at the time I just thought it's ridiculous that someone would call themselves a philosopher. But obviously there was nothing else that I was actually doing at the time. So I thought, yeah, I'll try it. But my relation to philosophy, I've always felt, is not maybe as it should be, or a normal relation to philosophy, or the kind of way of working with philosophy that one is supposed to have. And I could compare it to my relation to music. A lot of people listen to a band and then they learn who the guitarist in that band is, and then they learn what other bands that guy's been in. They collect all the albums, and then they find out who they're influenced by, and then they collect all the albums by those bands, and they listen to them all, and they become a kind of walking encyclopedia of a certain genre of music or a certain lineage. Well, a lot of people treat philosophy like that, but I'm neither a geek nor a nerd, my eternal discredit. And my relationship to philosophy has been more like my relation to music, where there are certain songs or albums that I listen to over and over again, and I never seem to get everything out of them, and I keep returning to them, and I keep listening to them, because there's some kind of perplexity, there's something that draws me to them, and there's something that I want to draw out of them, and they seem kind of inexhaustible. And so it's a kind of obsessive relation to listening to certain philosophical tunes and returning to them over years and years. You could also think of it as if you've ever been a parent or looked after a child, you find yourself reading the same book over and over again, literally hundreds of times over years and years. Like one of my favorite books is Fox in Socks by Dr. Seuss. And the amazing thing about this is like you really learn the difference between good and bad books, because Fox in Socks, you could read it like 1,000 times and there's still something there. Like you're still, every time you read it, you're entering into this world and it's full of like little details. So yeah, my relationship to philosophy is a bit like reading Fox in Socks over and over again. I think like the primal scene for me was that my parents were really into kind of political activism, not in a huge way, but they were involved in, particularly in anti-nuclear protests. So a lot of my childhood, I went on marches against like nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons. It was like the tail end of the Cold War. And I was often surrounded by literature about how at any minute this apocalypse could come upon us and like you'd only have 3 minutes left before everything ended. And I think as a child, that makes quite an impression on you. And it was really my introduction at an early age into nihilism, because, you know, you were meant to be really angry about this, angry with the government and protesting. But for me, it was like, wow, just imagine those 3 minutes. You can do anything you want and nothing matters. And I think that's something that stayed with me my whole life, is just this kind of opening onto nihilism. And when climate change became, you know, the major topic of conversation, it was something quite familiar to me, this sense of, you know, how do we conduct ourselves? How do we think when we know that everything's just about to end? So I think maybe that kind of set me on a path of knowing that, in a sense, you know, all of the social conventions and norms and behaviors, in a sense, are all kind of a lie. You know, that's a very teenage kind of sentiment. But often I think like the further I go into philosophy, the more I return to the sentiments I had as a teenager, hopefully in a more sophisticated way. But I didn't know what philosophy was at all. I had no idea what it was. And I actually ended up doing philosophy as a subject kind of by accident. But then I don't think anyone does it on purpose, do they? Like most people arrive at philosophy through some kind of accident, or, you know, just find themselves doing it and realize this is what I want to do. So when I was a kid, I was really into computers. Like I had the first home computer ever made or ever sold in the UK. And I learned programming, and like I was really into, you had to program because otherwise you couldn't do anything with it. And I kind of dreamt about a life being a programmer, which if I'd done that, I would have been a lot richer today. And I tried to, when I was at school, I absolutely hated school. Like my secondary school, I ended up really just not going at all. And I was a kind of slightly feral child. Like I lived with my dad and he was quite distant and didn't really supervise me very much. So I wasn't really like schooled in, I don't think I was really socialized. And school just became just like totally distasteful to me, and I stopped going. But then when I did my A-levels, which was like when I was 16, I think my dad kind of had the prescience to move us to somewhere which was a bit more of an interesting place. I grew up in like a really boring small town, and we moved to Cambridge, which was the city nearest. And I went to a little college there to do A-levels. And I tried to do computer science, but I couldn't do it because of some timetable problem. And I saw philosophy and I thought, well, I'll do that. And doing that course was probably like the most important decision in my life. And it was completely an accident. And we had two really amazing teachers. And specifically, I remember Alison Ainley, who is, she was working at the time on Irigaray, but she taught at like this group of 16-year-olds. And in particular, I remember like we used to have to read out Platonic dialogues, which was really fun because the group was kind of like, it was this classic high school group. Like there was the unpopular kid who liked D&D. There was a goth. There was like the hippie girl. And then there was this theatre kid who was like really flamboyant. And so reading out these Platonic dialogues was amazing because you realize like when you start reading them out, how much you can change them by saying Socrates' lines in particular, like in a certain tone. And, you know, the characters are actually quite compelling and quite amusing when you're doing it live, as so to speak. So, yeah, that just really got me into philosophy and made me realize this is absolutely something that seems this is a way of thinking that seems natural to me, like that seems like this is what I'm doing anyway. And it was amazing to feel like this is not just a tiny private world where I'm wrestling with weird thoughts. This is actually a thing that exists and that you're allowed to do in some respect. So yeah, that's kind of what got me on the road. And also in that class, I used to make a comic, which was like based on the stuff that we've been learning, called Philosophy Comics with an X. It was like a little photocopied zine. So that was also the beginning of my publishing career.
That's a nice tidbit. I mean, obviously, we can maybe get to that in a minute. Thank you so much for sharing that, Maya. And Amy, I guess if you would like to go down memory road with us on your journey, and obviously your trajectory intertwines at certain points.
It's connected insofar as Maya's publishing career would actually become instrumental in, I suppose, the things that I would start to find myself doing in terms of philosophy and like writing about theory connected to CCRU and that sort of area. My story is also similar in lots of ways. Nihilism and Nietzsche were a big part of it. Again, in a very teenage way, but a way that I think like you can mature with very effectively as well. You don't have to kind of sublate it in some like dialectical heroic overcoming and become more mature and adult and get into like Badiou or something. I grew up in a pretty isolated, crappy rural town in Australia. It was very boring. There was nothing much going on. And I went to a religious girls' school. I think the thing that really, like, looking back, pushed me into a nihilistic way of viewing the world was one, just being in this very kind of like boring suburban place where the biggest aspirations people had were to, I don't know, own a house in the fancy part of town. Was when the principal of our school died suddenly in what was a kind of ghastly sex crime. Didn't involve any other people, but it was like, you know, very revelatory concerning what lay beneath this kind of suburban middle-class man's religious commitments and so-called values that we would hear intoned every Friday morning at chapel assembly or whatever. I mean, I hated this school from the beginning and I hated everything about it. Was constantly in trouble there. And this, in a way, just kind of like cemented my understanding of that whole world. I went through a big teenage period of just being like, everything means nothing. All of these limits that we supposedly have imposed on us are completely makeshift. And the same way that Maya would think about this like moment before nuclear Armageddon, where you could do anything and nothing would matter, I would kind of think like, you know, I get like teenage depression and be like, well, even if I get totally depressed and I'm going to die, at least if I have nothing to lose, I can do like one final extreme act before I do die. And interestingly, looking back on like this kind of like interesting, like extreme experience that I had as a teenager and in my early 20s, I feel actually has a lot of like gender undertones. Like it was also like a kind of aspirational masculinity. Like I wanted to not be feminine. So I wanted to do all this like extreme sort of stuff. So I can kind of go back and like sort of unpack it a bit now. But it kind of like, I don't know, you just sort of like have these kind of moments where steer you off the path of like some kind of aspirational, heteronormative, reproductive lifestyle. So I kind of always wanted to do something different and was always interested in art and stuff. I ended up, I mean, like, you know, because of the place I lived, I finished high school and I worked in an abattoir for a year because I was like, just really hated school so much. I didn't get high enough marks to get into uni. So I had to go to university as a mature age student through a like special kind of path for disadvantaged students from the country. I enrolled in philosophy in first year and I did 2 terms of it and dropped it because it sucks so much. And I did like art history and literature and like all of these kind of art subjects. And I ended up really, I think, having my philosophical education through Julian Pafanis, who was a kind of like 1980s, 1990s Baudrillard Bataille scholar. He was one of the people who wrote one of the very first books in English on Bataille, published the same year as Nick Land's Thirst for Annihilation.
And Chaosmosis, right? He co-translated it. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was my art history teacher. And he would teach art history through basically French post-structuralism. I learned philosophy in an art history department. And this was, I think, really good. Well, a lot better than learning it in the philosophy department. And that kind of set the scene, I guess, for how I would approach philosophy like later on. You know, I was really interested in bataille because of my like previous interest in extreme experience. And from that, I basically taught myself, I suppose, like, mid to late 20th century French philosophy. I wrote an English literature master's on bataille. And then when I went to kind of like do a PhD, I ended up doing a creative writing PhD. But for some reason, I decided that in order to like write about poetry, I had to begin with a theory of time. And so I ended up kind of writing. My PhD actually didn't really get finished for various reasons, even though I have a PhD. But like I ended up basically doing a philosophy PhD in a creative writing department. So following on from this idea of learning philosophy in an art history department. And then I kind of left the institution. So my kind of relationship with philosophy has always been kind of from the outside of the space you're supposed to do philosophy in. And of course, like I encountered collapse and urbanomic and phagnoumena early on while doing my PhD, because just before I was about to submit my master's on Georges Bataille, a good friend of mine, shout out to Patrick Quick, kind of like stopped me on the art history library steps at Sydney University and said, I hear you're writing on Georges Bataille. Have you read this crazy book by Nick Land called Thirst for Annihilation? And I was like, I don't have time to like read anything. I'd been reading Benjamin Noyes, like there's some irony for you. So to read anything new before I submit this thing. So it was like years later, I kind of remembered the intensity with which Patrick mentioned this book and looked it up. And then I realized Urbanomic had just published Phagnoumena. And that kind of got me connected to all of this stuff that ended up becoming really definitive for the things I was interested in. And then eventually, like, for my life.
That's wonderful. And we got two for the price of one this time. We normally have one origin story. So that's nice. And I'm glad that you brought together how you two sort of, or how you got informed of one another, but I guess you may have left out or intimated, because this isn't the first time you've collaborated. I could be wrong. Is this the first time you've co-authored? But you, Amy, I know that you were working on, is it Bonnet you translated?
Yeah.
Yeah, the infraworlds we translated together.
Okay, so you have worked together, but is this the first like text?
This is the first time we've co-written together.
Okay.
Well, that we've published something we've co-written together.
Okay. And I suppose I would nudge before we get into the meat of the cute matter. You give a little bit of a background, and obviously at the beginning of the exposition in the cutest way of writing it together. But do you want to say a word or two about the formation of this text or the process?
We both always agreed in terms of our philosophical kind of principles that philosophy began from some kind of experience. And like the ontology of the problem that is familiar from Deleuze and Guattari or from Deleuze is like obviously something that's intensely felt by both of us. And we were kind of, we've, I guess, met in 2014. I was running a reading group called Aesthetics After Finitude and had contacted Maya several times to get texts and things like that. And we met at the book launch for Accelerate, the Accelerationist reader in London. And at that time, the left accelerationists, which is like Nick Slernick, Alex Williams, Peter Wolfendale, they just published the manifesto for accelerationist politics. I remember them saying, like, we don't have enough accelerationist girls. We need to get some more girls. So I got recruited to the left accelerationist secret chat. And Maya was in there, a couple of other people like Mark Fisher, Helen Hester, Luke Fraser. Oh no, was Luca in there? I don't remember. But some of the early xenofeminist collaborations came from this space as well. I got to know Maya through this chat. I kind of found it a bit like difficult, actually. Like I felt like a little bit like people weren't really interested in what I was saying. I was very into land at the time and CCRU, and they were kind of very interested in overcoming that. And Maya would always stand up for me when I started making points on the chat and stuff. And I found kind of from early on that we shared a lot in terms of our philosophical worldview. And we kind of just maintained this friendship for a long time when I went back to Australia after being in London. And I think it was really like when Mark Fisher died, it was obviously like a pretty hectic moment. And we kind of were looking after each other, I suppose, checking on each other a lot. And long story short, like over a long period of years and getting to know each other, mostly just, we'd only spent like a few events where we'd actually seen each other physically. Our friendship kind of like got more and more intense until this kind of moment at the very end of 2019, we both independently realized that we were in love with each other, not just best friends on chat. And this was a realization, obviously, that, whether you confess it or not, completely like explodes your life. Because like, what do? Suddenly you're like, wait a minute, do I like affirm this realization or do I bury it because it's inconvenient to have right now? And, we lived on opposite sides of the world. We hadn't seen each other for 6 years, I think. QDAC really came out of that moment. And I remember writing something at the time about like, you want to talk about the death drive and the way that Deleuze talks about it in Difference and Repetition. And you want to talk about like what breaks you out of a refrain. One of the really good examples of that is falling in love. Like you cannot make a refrain when all of a sudden your whole life, what you're doing when you wake up in the morning and how you understand like the previous years is completely upended and ungrounded. And Maya had a similar experience. And we both found ourselves kind of like, completely ungrounded because of this realization. I was living in a tent. Maya was living in a field. We basically had to start from zero to rebuild our lives based on this commitment we've made to this affirmation, like, which was this event of falling in love. And that, I think...
That was like when we first started writing, really. And just literally like trying to write to understand the bizarre temporal structure of this experience and the kind of catastrophic, or as we would now say, anastrophic nature of what was going on. But also, increasingly, writing became a way of trying to come to terms with the way in which this event had kind of softened us and opened us up to modes of affect that perhaps were incongruous with the type of philosophy we were doing. And we had to like reach some kind of reckoning with that, which is where the concept or the joke really of cute accelerationism came from. It's like, okay, this is happening to us. This is what it's doing to us. This is how it's making us feel. It's completely incompatible with this kind of aggressive Terminator style accelerationism. And yet it seems to have a suspiciously similar structure in terms of this, like things only making sense backwards from the future. It seems like everything that had happened had led up to this moment, which was now propagating itself backwards and making sense of our whole lives. So there was this interesting problem that we were grappling with. And we didn't expect it to like produce a book. We weren't really kind of trying to philosophize about it. But in a way, this comes back to what I was saying about the way that I feel like I do philosophy, which is that, I've begun to see the reason why Deleuze is so valuable to me is that he provides a kind of meta discourse about what it is to think, right? Which is Deleuze's theory of ideas, which is that ideas aren't things that are in your head that you can introspect and analyze and think about. They're things that are out there, fields of intensity or tension that you encounter, which perplex you, and which then, in a sense, if you're a philosopher, you try to hold fast to hold on to keep facing. You try to stay with the problem, even if it's like stretching the limits of what you're able to think, even if it's oppressing you, even if it's painful. And then from this attempt to stay with the problem, to kind of exert a kind of pressure on the problem, even you could say to love the problem, then thinking begins to emerge. And I think that's what happened, is that we held on to this thing, even though we weren't sure what it was. And we kept kind of pressing on it over a period of years and years, really. Like some of the paragraphs in this book were written 4 years ago or so, and we didn't know what we were writing about then. So it all came from this experience. And then it was only later that through the word cute which had kind of just occurred to us as a silly way of describing what was going on, we then began to say, well, we began to like look into the wider culture and say, cute is a thing that's happening, and to try and understand what the relation was between what we had been trying to think and what was going on in this kind of wider sense of people kind of surrendering to cuteness on a cultural level.
I love that. And it reminds me very early on in the text, there's just this one line that struck me, and it's put into new light. Anyone who has ever fallen in love gets it. And I guess that was in response to voluntary surrender, demonic possession, and the Deleuze quote, movements for which one can only be a patient, but the patient in turn can only be a larva, right? And then anyone who's ever fallen in love gets it. So that line now it feels to have new depth, even if maybe we're more concerned with surfaces, but no, but still, I appreciate that and illuminating so much of that.
I mean, that's the point, people tend to not believe you when you say things like this. But I mean, that literally is what happened. The whole thing just came out of encountering a problem and just kind of, exerting this gentle pressure on this problem over time without knowing why. And by going through this experience, which was kind of an experience of surrendering to a process which held, a lot of risks for both of us in terms of personal, social, familial challenges. And, since this happened over lockdown as well, we were actually
stuck on opposite sides of the world.
We were literally we were conducting this love affair through the entire depth of the planet from one side to the other. It was really an ordeal, but also a passion. And everything that's in this book literally just kind of poured out of that, including the footnotes, which were done a lot later. They're all the product of this encounter having happened.
I think it's also important to mention here, though, this is not us having something happen to us and then recounting it in a memoir format or something.
Right.
Because what happened was we felt ourselves undergoing this transformative process of, as I said before, total ungrounding without any understanding of where it might go, how disastrous it might end up being, but committing to it nonetheless. And then kind of seeing or feeling ourselves become swept up in a cultural moment and watching this same kind of ungrounding occur in various ways through cuteness to large collectivities of people, various online subcultures. The way that the joke about cute accelerationism was picked up on Twitter in early 2020 by various people. People were it's sort of there are a lot of people now with Cudac in their handles or whatever. But back in that kind of moment at the end of the sort of real fecund weird theory moment on Twitter, Cudac kind of became this joke, and there were all these people with Cudac in their handles and talking about when they're waiting for Cudac to happen. And we were this is people are picking this up and are really interested in it. What is this thing? Maybe it's more than just our experience. And so that kind of began also the trajectory of trying to explore it. It's not at all positioned in the book as something that happened to us. It's just the way that you can enter into the structure of understanding the event of cutification and the transformative activity it exerts on you is one of the ways is through love. But it kind of ends up dovetailing with a lot of other things. And one of them was gender exploration and transformation as well.
I think in the end, we discovered that falling in love, cuteness, gender transition, capital acceleration, all had these kind of weird structural analogies. They were all, in a sense, versions of the same kind of anastrophic process, which was a surprise.
And I like that the last, because we do have, you mentioned, Deleuze, we do have a little bit of the chapters. I love the art, by the way. And they're, what would you say, they're scramblings or maybe pulling from the database, if you will, and reworking some of the little images we get in 1,000 Plateaus.
Yeah.
And the very last one is cute. No vanillas or cute happened. So I like
So I think at a certain point we came up with a couple of these titles, and then it became an obsessive mission for me to do as many as possible and see how many of these titles we could cutify, which is part of the kind of general strategy of the book, which is, the mode of writing and the mellifluence of the prose had to also be cute. Everything had to be cutified, like it had to do what it said. But also, the book is in many senses is a kind of homage to Thousand Plateaus in particular, and the type of writing that Deleuze and Guattari produced in general, which is that I think what both of us were hugely compelled by is this style of writing which doesn't simply set out explicitly and clearly its premises and its arguments and lead you along, but a kind of writing that really perplexes you, that draws from all different places in order to kind of place you in the middle of a type of puzzle. Now, the fact that it's a puzzle is then a hugely positive thing, because it means that you have to, as a reader, participate in building the thing that you're reading. You have to find the keys, you have to construct your own way through it. And hopefully that, that's the kind of text that we wanted to produce as well, where, it's not simply telling you what to think. It's giving you this whole kind of almost a dense unconscious of linkages and resources. And
it's more like a kind of magical initiation where you have to figure everything out yourself. And it's about putting the neophyte into a position where they have to undertake their own journey of research and exploration, rather than some bossy doctrinal text laying everything out with supposed transparency, but actually kind of like being a little bit tyrannical. Like, here's the truth, you just need to learn it. Right. And then put it into action, kind of thing. And that, the sort of political moment we all emerged from in 2020 was this kind of moment. If you're not absolutely transparent, especially politically transparent about what you're saying, we might need to, you're kind of suspect. Yeah. Why are you not being transparent, sort of thing? And so much kind of joyfulness and play, and this, I think, nurturing, where you give someone a puzzle and let them figure it out, was lost. So part of it was trying to bring that back to philosophy, bring the silliness back to philosophy too.
Yeah.
Everything just got so serious.
Again, I think there's something very specific to Deleuze's way of writing, where I still think we haven't even started. I'll speak for myself. I haven't even started to understand what Deleuze is doing. And I think a lot of the time he didn't fully understand what he was doing himself. That seems obvious. Right. In Difference and Repetition, he's really writing faster than he's able to really kind of collect everything and know exactly what he's saying. But there's something amazing about Deleuze has these kind of ciphers. So I wrote this huge long note about the egg, which is, I think, the first note in the footnotes. And sometimes you come across these things in Deleuze and you're like, the egg becomes this kind of magical cipher that enables you to link together all kinds of parts of his work, very heterogeneous things. And it's almost like you've come across the key to everything, but it's not really explicitly. It's not like on page 1 he says, I shall begin with the egg, and then I shall divide this into these different categories of egginess. And that, it's not set out like that, but there's this very interesting kind of structural trope that you find in Deleuze, where there are these kind of magical ciphers. I wanted to go back to the origin story for a moment, because I was just thinking about Thousand Plateaus. I was thinking of 2 moments in libraries that I experienced. When I was a kid, I was really into computers, as I said. And so the computer section of the library was right at the beginning. I don't know whether it was Dewey or something else, but it was 0.001. And for some reason, that was next to the occult section. So I went looking for computer books one day, and every now and again, I used to go to the occult section. I'd get a book about UFOs or spontaneous human combustion or whatever. But one day I went there, and there was a collection of Lovecraft stories, which I've still got today, which had this really schlocky kind of gore-soaked picture of a weird blubbery demon on top of a volcano or something. So I thought, oh, okay, I'll get that. Now, years later, when I was in Warwick University, still then I hated being at school. I didn't go to lectures. I was never able to integrate into the institution at all. So sometimes I just hang out in the library, and I was just going through the philosophy section. This was before I'd met Nick Land, and before I like started studying Deleuze or anything, and I just found 1,000 Plateaus.
Mhm.
And the reason why I got it out of the library was because I looked in the index and Lovecraft was in there, and I was like, yes, philosophy that talks about Lovecraft. So that was what attracted me initially to 1,000. Yeah, it's all just like this ramified series of accidents.
Just a little singularity.
Yeah.
Yeah. It reminds me, Coop, of seeing like the Dune reference in 1,000 Plateaus. Be like, oh, there it is. I do think that you're right about the egg, and I do like that you start that note. I guess it's note 7, even if you may have written it first. You start with mentioning Lovecraft before going into this exposition of the egg, and it does recur throughout his work and in obviously the co-written work. It's very important. I did think it was interesting that. And I don't necessarily mean to put you on the spot, but I like that you kind of point out maybe Deleuze getting the stuff about the egg from Rouillet is overblown. And in fact, the real source is Dalk, which is why you spend so much time working through that source material, which I think is helpful because not all of it's translated. And I guess that may be more of a point directed at Christian Kerslake's book on Deleuze and the unconscious, but I'm not exactly sure. But I did like you were just like, yeah, Rouillet, he studied embryology in the prison camps and maybe wrote about embryogenesis at the end of the life, and he did talk about the egg a lot. But the real material seems to be more from Dalk, and so I thought that was an interesting point.
I think my claim is just that you can get what you need out of the primary material without having to like construct a lineage made purely out of philosophers, because I don't think that's how Deleuze worked, right?
Okay, that makes sense.
But Kerslake's book, I think, is brilliant. I think he's kind of one of the great decipherers of these esoteric ciphers in Deleuze, for sure. But I think sometimes like the temptation is in Deleuze scholarship to try to place him within a lineage of philosophy, which he explicitly kind of repudiates. He's in all of his work, he's dealing with heterogeneous sources and disciplines.
Sticking with difference repetition, chapter 4 is going through the history of the calculus and mathematics. Chapter 5 is where we get a lot of that stuff about embryogenesis, because now we're looking at the other side of differentiation with a C, right? I think that makes sense. And then just thinking about, the way in which 1,000 Plateaus draws from all these different disciplines, and there's a way in which that type of rhizomatic interdisciplinarity, if you will, features in this book, because cute is looked at not just from a sociological perspective or with ethology and even etymology. I mean, I know that you run through some of the lenses it's looked at, but I suppose that is an interesting question in terms of the process of writing the book. Did that become maybe something that needed to be done? This more, I mean, speaking of the puzzle pieces, right? There's so many entryways that can grab a reader in terms of cute as a process, that you do have these different, I don't want to say the methodology, what's the word? These different disciplinary approaches, or these different avenues into approaching the topic.
Yeah, there's like it kind of begins with sort of an etymological exploration of cute in English. There's a kind of, and like connected to the history of cuteness as it moves through like evolutionary biology to commodification to the kind of like postmodern circuitry of consumption reproduction in like 1990s manga and anime circles. There's like the kind of critique of the contemporary discourses of cuteness as not being able to exhaust cute. There's the ethology of cuteness. So yeah, there is like all of these different disciplinary entryways into cute.
This comes back to the fact that cute is an idea or a problem, right? It's something that's intruding into our culture and our consciousness, but no disciplinary treatment of it is really able to exhaust what it's doing to us. And ultimately, since the contemporary version of cute is a kind of convergence of various different cultural histories, from Japan, Korea, the West, like American culture, Disney, and so on.
Yeah.
It's converging, it's developing, and therefore what cute is in itself is really a question for the future. It's like something we haven't reached yet because it's always intensifying.
So kind of, I suppose what we're doing in each of these sections is like tracing out what we, the kind of like path that cute has tracked through culture, through biology, through capitalism, through language, and showing where it still is in some kind of excess of the explanatory resources of each of those fields.
Going back to the egg for just a second, I really like another footnote on, and which harkens back a little bit to Plateau 3 of 1,000 Plateaus, the controversy, if you will, or maybe the struggle between Geoffrey Saint-Hilaire and Cuvier, and finding in sort of replaying this debate, and you go through Balzac, I think, right? Or am I wrong? I'm trying to remember. I guess what is interesting is coming out with a kind of speculative morphology that I think gives a nice addition or complementarity to what the egg can do. And then that, I think, maybe sets us up to get into these other circuits later, like the interplay between nature, market, database, and the interfacing of those, and the redounding of each upon each other, and including what you kind of promised very early on in the text, this notion of a kind of inhuman future for cute, which I found a little bit titillating at the beginning and wasn't quite sure where it was going to go. But as I kind of mentioned in passing, the AI possibilities and, the digital unconscious, which is a lovely, lovely term. And you've got an amazing diagram. So shout out to,
Inigo Wilkins did the diagram.
Yeah. Shout out to that diagram is amazing. But in any case, I guess I don't know where to throw the question, but I did want to lay out some of that, especially maybe the biological part, and we can possibly work our way to the inhuman, which I think is fascinating as well.
I think maybe the thing that makes that the intermediary step between those two topics is the fact that the egg is also a trope in trans discourse. So this idea of being an egg, or being an egg as someone who hasn't realized yet that they're trans, connects the idea of the egg to gender and the body and the way that we talk about it in the book, and then to kind of the future of cute as this transformative process. So I guess all of the stuff with Geoffroy and Cuvier is sort of related to this idea of transformation of the body, the actual material body, which is something that you get a lot of critique of in kind of reactionary circles, as you can never overcome nature. You can make all of these little discursive or immaterial changes, these changes that coincide with the remit of social constructivism. You can change your pronouns, you can change language, but you can never really penetrate the reality of sex. So the point of bringing the Cuvier and Geoffroy debate back is to kind of challenge that idea. And this also is a through line from the Xenofeminist manifesto as well, this idea of changing nature. So it's kind of how deep can you go with transformations of the matter of the body? And I think the thing that's really interesting about Geoffroy's approach to biology is that obviously he has this transcendental approach where he sees all of the animals as part of the same plane of consistency, rather than being the products of preset forms that are then actualized based on the map that they begin with, following Cuvier.
I think what's crucial here is, what Deleuze sees in this debate is that this is not simply a debate within biology. It's a confrontation of profoundly contrasting philosophical positions, right? Cuvier is very fixated on the existing categories and compartments of nature, and the fact that a crab is different to a tiger is different to an insect. Geoffroy's kind of strangely flamboyant transcendental approach is this kind of amazing philosophical flight that enables him to see these continuities which are impossible, like things that are impossible in the empirical realm. You can't actually fold a crab into a tiger and then fold the tiger into an insect. But in principle, transcendentally, there's this continuity, right?
I mean, one of the notes that comes up later, are not notes as in footnotes, but one of the tonalities is the question of the virtual body.
Okay, hold on. I think I've got it now. Right.
Okay,
so
good.
I think what we're talking about is from this kind of extravagant transcendental position, one is able to refuse the idea that nature is fixed for all time. One is able to accept that there are these kind of stratified blockages. One can't just simply leap into this fluidity, go down to the body without organs and make yourself into a crab. And yet, in principle, there is no in principle reason why transformation is impossible. Nature can't be held up as this completely fixed Procrustean basis which prevents any transformation in principle from happening. And this goes hand in hand with a refusal of the distinction between the trivial and the serious. This runs right through the book, like the condemnation of cuteness, of certain types of online social discourse or image sharing, self-transformation as trivial, as superficial, and as something which can never change nature, I think is something that we attack over and over again, because what we see is that these supposedly trivial experimentations with changing oneself are actually driving forces in culture and technology, which are enabling the production of the means to drill down deeper and deeper into supposedly what's called nature and enable deeper transformations. So in principle, there's no Procrustean bed of nature that we can't break through. And the apparently trivial can often be a kind of entryway into deeper transformations.
There's also the reference in the Geology of Morals to, the abstract machine that stands up and accesses all of the strata. Is it the epistrata? This is technology. So it's kind of as soon as you get technology into a feedback loop with desire, these trivial kind of acts of, posting images or changing your identity in so-called superficial ways can accumulate a force of collective desire, which feeds back into actually building the technologies that allow these things to happen and continues on and on and on. So it's not ever a question of a dualism between material reality and a kind of discursive or immaterial irreality or unreality.
And again, I think this is reflected in experience, or perhaps this insight actually comes from experience, in the sense that if you're experimenting with your gender, social media becomes an important tool for you to be able to kind of experiment, present yourself in a certain way, which you may then be I'm going to actually start wearing a skirt outside. I'm going to actually take hormones. I'm going to actually have surgery. All of these profound transformations can be triggered by the experience of producing cute images.
That goes, both of what you just said goes to that diagram I mentioned, where there are these feedback loops into each other, and particularly this notion of rigging. I think at one point you say cutification as a process is impossible without the notion of rigging, which I think goes back to the technological capacities once that enters the scene. And once we even, especially accelerating when we start talking about social media and digital media, which is funny because all of this, one of the conceptual personae against which there is a struggle is, I was curious about this term, daddy admin. I thought that this was like a nice terminology for almost like the super ego reigning over a server, moderating like comments or something like this. Do you want to say like exactly. A word or two about that? That was wonderful.
Can I just say one more thing about this, the Cuvier thing? So it comes back to the egg again, which is like the egg is this transcendental figure, the body without organs, the egg. And at every stage, we try to maintain, in principle, the transcendental limit, the egg, absolute fluidity, the absolute ability to transform yourself without being blind to the fact that empirically there are blockages. There are things that, as Deleuze says, things which are impossible for an adult to do, that only an embryo can do. And there's a limit to the extent to which we're able to, as we say, regress, to become an embryo, to return to potentials which have been lost in the process of development and socialization and so on. And yet we always carry our egg with us. It's always there. There is always this potential for transformation.
I really like that addition because it.
So, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. No,
so
go ahead.
What I was trying to get to was, so one line that I really love in the book is when we say cuteness is at once the impossible dream of returning to the egg, but it's also the patient step-by-step ordeal or labor of dismantling the sausage machine, which means dismantling all of Daddy Admin's constraints and prohibitions on what's natural and what's not, on what you're able to do and what you're not able to do, on what's embarrassing and shameful and silly. So maintaining that transcendental point of view, the point of view of the egg, is crucial to being able to carry out that day-to-day labor of working against the powers that be, whether it's Cuvier or Daddy Admin.
This is also related to the point that we make several times in the book about intensive desire. I mean, Mark Fisher calls it a feminine mode of desire. So does Sadie Plant. We quote them both saying these things. If you're maintaining your desire intensely on a plateau without searching for consummation, this is a feminine mode of desire because it doesn't have an object or an end or a goal. It's about building this intensity, like edging or even masochistic desire. Or I think like there's a really nice parallel between 2D love, so someone who loves a two-dimensional character, where they can never consummate their love in the kind of normalized way, and courtly love, which is a similar thing. Like the knight loves the lady from afar, and it's never a consummated love. So its intensity can like constantly build. And this is where the productivity comes from. This is the perspective of the egg. Whereas the perspective of Daddy Admin is the superego, it's the repressive ego, it's identity, which is where shame comes from. It's the thing that stops you from trying something just to see. And then like maybe having an affective experience that you might be able to run with to explore and see like if it takes you somewhere else. It's the thing that shuts everything down. Like we dramatize it in the book in terms of the bedroom, which I think is a really important space for contemporary culture, and especially contemporary cute culture, because of the internet, of course. And like it's the control room for a lot of the interesting things that happen online. Is like the bedroom, the teenage bedroom, or your space in the house. And like Daddy Admin kind of knocks on the door and it's like, what are you doing in there? kind of thing. Come outside, come and talk to the family or whatever. It's also a trope that comes from, it's like a kind of homage to the Cyber Feminist Manifesto for the 21st Century by VNS Matrix, where they talk about Big Daddy Mainframe as the antagonist who is shutting down the sort of slime desire of the manifesto. So it's kind of pulling all of these things together.
Yeah, he's the one who tries to, at every stage, diffuse your enthusiasm and bring you back into yourself and into the strata.
It's also like, I like to sort of say Kudak is post-cringe. Like the voice inside your head that's like, I'm not going to do that because it's cringe, or that accepts other people's judgment of something you're doing as cringe, is the thing that's shutting down all of the possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, again, that in that respect, the book does what it says. It was a risk, and it is potentially cringy And there was a certain kind of fear and doubt and worry about, like, are we just kind of totally delirious? Do we actually know what we're doing? Can we really release this text? But, sometimes you've just got to do it and see what happens.
I think the thing that you realize when you really lean into post-cringe is that no one knows what they're doing. And sometimes you just gotta go with the thing that makes something happen.
But also, I think one thing that maybe gave us faith in it was that we both felt that we'd attained an effective level of tension between being as silly as we possibly could and maintaining this ridiculously kind of in-depth philosophical background. So it was after we'd written the notes that it really seemed like this could really work, because you have those two sides kind of pulling against each other and as different entry points. And somehow then it gains this kind of structural integrity which holds it together. And Daddy Admin can't look at it and simply dismiss it.
I was just going to say this kind of resonates a little bit because of the time and place that I grew up in Texas on a cattle ranch. I have been somewhat, resistant a little bit towards like anime consumption, because there's, even in these, for lack of a better word, like auteur level, something like Paprika or Evangelion, right? There's always these elements of whimsy that end up coming, that bubble up within these, that I've always had this sort of resistance to. So just something to realize in my own self with regard to cringe and like moving towards post-cringe.
When I was researching stuff for the work on Moe, I was listening to a lot of anime podcasts in English that were mostly coming from America. And it was really interesting experiencing or starting to like notice the different way that Americans talked about anime versus Japanese fans. And so there was a kind of, the thing that really struck me was that a lot of the time the American commentators were really afraid of either relating to characters, talking about liking characters, or like being excited by like those more whimsical elements, because they were understanding their taste in anime as being interpreted as representative of their taste in reality. They're approaching anime and two-dimensional animated cartoon as a representation of reality, and their desires and interests within that space can then be transferred one-to-one on their everyday lives or whatever. So if you're kind of like an older man and you're interested in cute girl characters, everyone's like, that's a bit sus. In Japan, this is like not so much an issue. There's a very important study by psychoanalyst Saito Tamaki. I think it was published in English translation around 2009, 2011. And he is really insistent on the fact that he did a lot of like field work and case studies with otaku and anime and manga fans, especially ones who had partners who were two-dimensional characters. And he was like, they don't see the world of anime and manga as a representation of reality at all. It's an alternative real that they're creating. He reads a lot of this through Lacan. So he's like, your real world relationships with people are fiction anyway. So why are they more real than the ones you have with a 2D character? But he bases this on like a really good analysis of the fact that the West is obsessed with this Platonic idea of getting outside of the cave and seeing the truth. And he analyzes this through a lot of the Western legislation of anime as well. The way that we like ban things that would not be banned in Japan. That in Japan, you can have all kinds of like representation of like perversions, what the West would see as a sexual perversion, just as long as you don't have the actual genitals of the characters shown. So when things are like censored, they just censor the genitals, but all kinds of insane things can be going on in the narrative. Whereas he's like in American censorship, you can show like a real life actor's genitals, but you can't have any suggestion of perversion. And he's like, what does this say about the psyche of the two cultures? Like, it's kind of an argument for another thing. But like, I think it's really interesting that like, when you're thinking about anime, one of the ways to maybe like disarm some of this sense of like, I'm not allowed to get into the cringy stuff or the cute girl characters, which is such a big part of Moe fandom, because it's like, somehow going to be representative of my like real life interests. It's just like that paradigm is just, it's not relevant to how this works in Japan. So there's something kind of freeing as well. And that's why like we kind of stand up as well for this idea of like two-dimensional love. There's a lot of interesting emancipatory elements to this particular fringe culture. But yeah, I mean, we could do a whole podcast just on that stuff.
There's also, there's a more general reactionary point of view, which is reflected in philosophical thinking, I think, which is that it tends to be thought that on one side, you have the idea of like critical distance and not becoming absorbed in what you're thinking about, what you're studying, and that's the right thing to do. And then on the other hand, there's like giving into your impulses, going with what you want to do. And that's always a recipe for degeneration and disaster. And for, in a sense, for like, that's the end of thought. If you give in to what you are interested in, what compels you. Now, our whole argument is to do with giving in, with surrendering, with going with what you want, even if you don't quite understand why you want it and why you like it. And cuteness, obviously, is a form of compulsion. It's like, it's not something that we decide to be into. It's something which is precisely poignant, acute, which has this kind of feeling of sharpness, almost unbearable desire attached to it. So it's to do with this kind of what happens if you surrender to this. Going back to the Deleuzean theory of ideas, I think it kind of overturns this, because what we have is like, if the ideas are sensations, if ideas are like structures of sensation, which are problematic, these fields of tension which you enter into, then by allowing yourself to go with them, by engaging with them, by participating in them, what happens is you unfold them further and you enter into a process of becoming. And that's what I think we're advocating for all the time, is like, go with it, enter into these kind of strange adventures of giving in to what you want. And in fact, that's productive. And I think that's a very accelerationist sentiment, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about cute as like, there's a becoming imperceptible to it in this surrender to cuteness and being post-cringe, rather than, I think even Nick himself said, you know, resistance is capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, Nick also has like resisted ever watching an anime, as far as I'm aware.
We did try to get him to watch, what is it, Serial Experiments Lane? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, I've seen so many people tell him he should watch specifically Serial Experiments Lane, and yeah, this is a kind of like interesting irony. But
I think you should say something there about resistance in relation to like your group none thing, and that kind of philosophical dichotomy that I was talking about like controlling yourself, distancing yourself versus giving in, is related to this idea that somehow resistance is harder and giving in is somehow easy. Whereas I think holding to a problem, allowing yourself to be absorbed into it, even to the extent that you risk yourself, is actually a very difficult labor. The labor of becoming is actually not easy at all. It's actually easier to resist, and it comes more naturally to resist.
I don't remember exactly what the quote is, but like one of the lines I was most proud of in the afterword to Revolutionary Demonology by the Gruppo de Nun is this idea that like resistance is the easiest thing to do in the world. Everyone wants you to resist. You're going to keep everything in its place if you repress that impulse to watch some anime or to whatever, to do something
that the cat ears on.
Yeah, to do something that your super ego or ego might think is cringe. You got to like, you know, make a little puncture for your id to seep through. In that particular text, it's kind of in the context of Evola, who is very much about this like very masculine, strong and manly relationship to reality and constructing reality. And the kind of like counter to that is actually, it's like the thing that everyone can do. It's kind of weak in a way. Like actually to be strong is to give in and to be able to resist the torsions that come with that. This is like the kind of idea of the adult being torn apart by what goes on in the embryo as well. So yeah, and there's that great quote from like an early Nick Land text, which I think is kind of like reprising something from anti-oedipus, which is revolution is not duty, but surrender. And I think this is like perfectly encapsulates the kind of subject position that we're advancing in cute accelerationism.
Bernard Stiegler has this interesting distinction somewhere between instinct and desire, where he says that, you know, under the conditions of capitalism, it's all too easy to simply become a kind of drone that's just responding to stimuli instinctively, and therefore you just become like part of this machine. Desire is something different because desire involves investment. And I think this is a way we can distinguish between what we're talking about, which is like accelerationism versus hedonism versus just like simply enjoying yourself like an idiot, right? Because I think what we're talking about is like a kind of commitment to perplexity and an investment, a desiring investment in something whose outcome is not entirely clear. That's what cuteness has in common with falling in love, has in common with accelerationism and the deterritorializing forces of capitalism. And if I can again like bring it back to the actual encounters that initiated some of this, you know, a lot of what went into cute accelerationism was my own experience with gender perplexity and exploration, which always started with some kind of sensation, like an experience of sensation, where I was like, that somehow feels good in a way that I didn't expect. What would happen if I let that happen? What would happen if I not only let it happen, but also committed to it? What happens if I post this on social media? And therefore I made a kind of social commitment. And I think there's an interesting pragmatist level to this, where, you know, making commitments and producing the reality of a transformation in yourself is bound up with like the social level of doing things. But it's always, in a sense, like you're always doing something where the outcome is uncertain and possibly scary, and you don't really know whether you want to do it. But the only way to know is by investing something in it. And then you kind of get locked into it and it transforms you. And then that opens up new pathways. Again, there's this kind of process of ramification. By letting go, you actually make things happen and produce complexity and produce change. That's what I've called in the past the Kurtz gradient. It's like this path that as you travel along it, what you are is constantly transforming. And that in QTAC, that becomes the Kurtz gradient instead.
I mean, that's really good. And we could, I was thinking of a number of your footnotes when you were just speaking about that.
I mean, in relation to this also, I think one of the things that, you know, people find it so easily to just dump on Deleuze and Guattari as if they're just like some kind of hippie idiots. But the account of becoming given in Thousand Plateaus, and particularly, you know, the becoming woman and the account of how gender is produced is really extraordinary. And just in general, I think we haven't maybe understood just what a technically capable model it is of modeling like these properly transformative experiences without resorting to identity.
Which is definitely, as you pointed out earlier, one of the enemies or one of the breaks, right? In the way that you talk about the present and the status quo as a break on acceleration. Identity would be another one of those breaks. Amy, you linked it to guilt and shame, which you have footnotes on as well. And obviously that's where the daddy admin has increases in power. And I think that also is interesting because of the fact that cute, as indicated on the very first page, insofar as it has no meaning, potentially has no identity, at least insofar as we can pin it down. It's the unpin downableness that I forget the author that.
Is it David May? David May.
I know that's in one of the footnotes, but that links it to the acuteness, right, or the oxymoronic nature of that.
Yeah, that thing about the oxymoronic was like one of the last things that we discovered when we were writing, and I thought that was kind of extraordinary.
The sharp blunt. I didn't know that about the etymology of oxymoronic, but that is interesting. Tracing cute back to oxus or something like this, right? You know, when you talk about cute as a process, you use two terms, and I was wondering if they're meant to be conflated or maybe complementary, where it becomes a cutification, right? Which reminds one of not just cutest process, but the intensification involved, right, in the acuteness of it. But there was also auto cutification, and I was wondering if those are distinct or maybe superposed, or if that was intentional or not. It's at the very end of the text. I think it's around that diagram, because so many of the footnotes point us towards that. Was it 153? No, sorry, 155. The 155th footnote, right, where we have that beautiful diagram. We get a discussion of the circuits. And so, you know, the first few times I saw the term acutification, I wasn't yet sure what to make of it. And it slowly dawned on me with the play on the etymology of tracing it back to acute and intensification. But I think at the top of 188, you also have the term auto-cutification. And I thought that was great too, because it does give credence to a notion of self-fashioning and letting oneself go into this process of self-transformation, if that makes sense.
I think acutification is the term for what cute as a transcendental idea is doing in history. It's refining the material instantiations of cute towards ever cuter versions. So it's acutifying. And interestingly, cuteness is really a kind of just rightness. So it's the acutification of just rightness, which is a kind of paradoxical maneuver. Whereas autocutification is something that is specific to the third circuit of acutification. And it's related to the kind of phase that we're in now. I mean, maybe we should run through those circuits to sort of put this in context.
I think that'd be great.
So this is the diagram that Inigo Wilkins drew for us when he was reading the text. As a kind of like historical story of acceleration, what we kind of discovered when we started to look into all of the different ways that cute is theorized is that it seems to begin, the account of cuteness in human history seems to begin in the biological realm with the Kinshasa schema.
But in fact, it's kind of retrojected, because it's in the 1940s that Konrad Lorenz defines this idea of the Kinshasa schema, which is like this diagram of the fact that the relative proportions of infantile features in humans and other mammals are different from adults, and that adults seem to have this irresistible response to these facial proportions of infants. So he says, you know, this is kind of one of a number of examples that he identifies of these fixed responses, kind of instinctive responses, in which, you know, an animal isn't kind of calculating and thinking about what they're seeing. There's just simply a kind of schema which matches something in the neural circuitry, and they respond to it. So obviously the implication there is that this is an evolutionarily useful strategy because it enables, or it promotes, adults looking after their young. But at the same time, what Lorenz is saying is, if we look at the way that dolls and teddy bears are produced, there seems to be a kind of accelerated evolutionary process whereby we're homing in on the Kinshasa schema and making ever more extreme versions of it that go way beyond what nature produces. So the interesting thing is Lorenz is already seeing that capitalism is accelerating the evolutionary cycle that he's retrojecting back into nature as the origin of cute. So cute reaches a kind of plateau because it becomes an evolutionarily stable strategy within nature, but then capitalism kind of picks up the relay and begins to shift it into the realm of what Lorenz's colleague Tinbergen calls the supernormal, i.e. kind of over-triggering these instinctive responses.
In a way that like capitalizes on the surplus and pulls them away from their original reproductive function. So you're now attached to a cute doll instead of looking after a human baby.
That's true. But even in the biological realm, cute is already escaping from simple reproductive utility because, you know, the fact that I react to your baby in the same way as I react to my baby.
In the same way as you react to a cute puppy. Like so, it starts to cross your own personal, immediate family lines into a kind of social tribal situation. But then it starts to cross species lines as well.
So there's some interesting research that's been done more recently where the kind of cognitive scientists are saying it could be that this kind of overflowing of cuteness, whereby I'm just as likely to want to pick up your baby as I am to pick up mine, and also I have empathy with dogs and cats, might be one of the sources of the social linguistic capacities of the human brain. So it may have been that cute was what made us human in the first place. But then in this second circuit of capital, obviously you're getting this kind of super acceleration of cuteness into forms which go way beyond what you'd experience in nature. So you're kind of over-triggering, over-stimulating the cute response. And that in turn is then driving you to build ever more cute objects. So what's happening is cute is kind of entering into human history in these kind of staggered stages. And at each stage, there's a kind of plateauing effect. So in the end, you know, as we see now in capitalism, there's cute things everywhere and none of them are particularly interesting. Like in a sense, we've kind of exhausted the consumer market phase of cuteness. And that's where it moves on to the third circuit.
Of auto-cutification. I think it's also important to mention in the second circuit of the market where supernormalization, so this like drawing on this surplus of cuteness in order to exaggerate it to the extent that our desire can be directed in all of these other ways that are away from natural biological reproduction into cute dolls and toys, but also sugar is like a really good example of supernormalization. Mm-hmm. So you take this thing that occurs naturally and that our brains are coded to make us crave because in a like situation where we're surviving in the tundra or whatever, it's important to have sugar. Where now it's like exaggerated to such a point that we like are kind of like drawn to it. I mean, pornography is another like example of supernormalization in contemporary culture. Again, pushing us away from like reproductive spheres. So there's this kind of like surplus value that is gradually kind of veering away from nature. And our kind of argument in the book is that when it comes to cuteness, what this does is it's not just kind of like a dead end, but it's activating latent spaces of desire, of the potentiality of desire to create novel forms of desire, novel kinds of social relationships. And this is really like kind of comes to a head in the third circuit, which I think these all kind of like asynchronous, but you can also read them as a history as well. The third circuit is the circuit of the internet and like decentralized media. And we call it the schizo database because it has a tendency to veer away from identity into like a schizophrenization of the self through this idea of fragmentation that we've taken from Haruki Izuma's theorization of the Moe element database. And also this postmodern loop of small groups, microcultures, subcultures getting together, usually because of the internet, finding each other because of the internet, and consuming something from the second circuit, from capitalist culture, and then refashioning it in their own way. Right. Whether that's like doing their own manga adaptations, making their own clothes, various kind of fandoms, cosplay. Like there's so many different versions of this, as many as there are microcultures, and producing these new zones of affect and different forms of desire. So the kind of courtly love of the two-dimensional lover is one of these versions.
So they can like take one cute element of a specific character who appears in a specific anime and become super obsessed with it and like intensify it in this more rapid circuit of the small collectives who are kind of getting excited about the thing that triggers their cute response and producing more and more heightened versions of it.
Yeah, so these are the moe elements that Azuma theorizes. And it's important, like, it's not like someone kind of mentioned the other day, like, why does this not explain Harry Potter fandom? I would say Harry Potter fandom isn't part of the schizo database because a lot of the time it's about reproducing full characters, whole identities,
right?
Maybe recasting them as queer or I don't know, like whatever, gender swapping them or something like that. But you're still working with like whole identities.
It's not partial objects. It's not molecular enough, right?
Totally. Yeah, exactly. The cool thing about the moe element database and manga and anime fandom is that a lot of, like Maya just said, a lot of this desire gets funneled onto just a specific element. So like cat ears or antennae, like the hair that goes like this, or like green hair, or like saggy socks, or a bell. Like all of these things have subcultures that fixate on them. And then we'll like, the thing that's important is that element and not the character that it's like, that it appears on.
Not the global person.
Yeah. So like desire suddenly kind of gets fragmented into all these partial objects, and these become the operators of these microcultures. And because of the way that cuteness sort of transfers itself very elegantly from objects to subjects, there's a kind of mimetic quality to cuteness where you can't interact with something cute without, to a certain extent, becoming cute, without disarticulating your speech and entering into kind of like baby language or baby talk, maybe taking on a cute kind of posture. It starts to like travel very, very quickly through culture because of this mimetic quality. And so auto-cutification is when, by being immersed in this microculture, you start to think about putting cat ears on yourself or making these changes to your own body. We start to talk about like the moe element database as a model of the future of gender. So gender is not going to be about gender identities anymore. It's not about like identifying as a certain gender or a certain like sub quality of gender as a kind of full identity, but it becomes this mix and match arena where you pull these elements out of the schizo database and you put them together, make a configuration in the same way that these manga and anime fandoms reconfigure the selection of moe elements from the database. That's where the auto-cutification comes in. It's on this third circuit.
So not just an individual, but also a collective auto-cutification with these groups working in tandem and together and intensifying.
Yeah, I mean, you don't even have to belong to a subculture. You can just like get onto whatever social media platform. Like you can watch a TikTok video of like someone experimenting one of these things, and then like you can enter into the circuit yourself. But the thing is, there's a kind of like a cumulative thrust to it where it's not just one person doing this. It starts to become like groups of people.
Would the potential fourth circuit with cute AI be an offshoot or just a further development of the third circuit? Is that why it's like there's a hesitation to call it a fourth?
It's because it's still speculative.
Right.
We don't really know what AI is doing, but we are like already interacting with the digital consciousness in this way that like Bognakonia kind of talks about, because we have these large language models, which are basically like the unconscious of our collective language use fed back to us.
So I've got here Grem, which is the beta version of a curio toy, which has been somehow Grimes is involved in this, promoting it.
Okay.
It's just got delivered last week. So this is like a cuddly, squishy toy with an embedded internet-connected AI. So you can talk, it gets to know you, it remembers things about you, and you can kind of go on little pretend adventures and imagine things with it. And it kind of talks in an incredibly cutesy way. And it's kind of glitchy at the moment. It's not great, but it's kind of amazing that you can sit and have a conversation with it. And you can very easily imagine a child developing a real relationship with this kind of toy that extends throughout their life. And so I think that's one part of Qt AI, is that it will enable us to have more in-depth, interactive relationships with Qt objects. And another side of it is, like, obviously we've seen in the incredible growth of large language models that AIs are capable of kind of feeling out weird latent spaces that perhaps we couldn't imagine. And I think the further acutification of Qt is probably going to come out of that, because maybe we've reached the end of human imagination as far as Qt goes. You know, there's certain innate limitations on our ability to continually acutify, and yet it seems clear that, you know, we haven't gone all the way. And I think AIs are going to be able to discover forms of cuteness that will probably be painful to us because they'll be so cute and we couldn't have imagined them ourselves. And that's how we see this whole trajectory. You know, it's like cuteness is in a sense synonymous with accelerationism. You know, cute accelerationism is a pleonasm, because cuteness simply is this process of becoming more and more acute. We were talking about the kind of isomorphism with Deleuze and Guattari's model of capitalism as well.
The thoughts of continuing the flow.
Was it how the circuits offcast things that may have made them possible? Like the market discards certain things, and so it comes up against that limit, axiomatizes, and then pushes it back. Is that what you're thinking of? I only overheard a little bit of what you said.
More so this idea that cuteness has this structure that's kind of like masochism or edging. So it never concludes. It's always displacing its limit. You can never like get beneath the surface. So this kind of, you know, this like famous formula that Deleuze and Guattari refer to in anti-oedipus about like, what is it? Like as the rate of profit falls, then the means of like becoming more
counteracting it
increase, and it just keeps like these two tendencies just keep counteracting, and capitalism has no outside. This is why all of these like this kind of like popular idea of accelerationism as meaning like the things have to get worse before they'll get better. We have to like make things worse, and then everything will explode, and then we'll have the utopia at the end or something, is like just nonsense. This is not what they say. It's going to like keep going forever unless you can kind of find some way to get rid of the reterritorializing, recuperative side of the equation to hit absolute deterritorialization. So cuteness has a similar structure, right? It delays consummation. You can always infinitely slide along its surface. You can cuddle it forever, but you can't get inside it. Is that what you were kind of getting at?
Yeah, but it's also, you know, don't confuse the product with the process. The Qt process is this thing which is continually intensifying, and it's a positive feedback loop in which the more cute things get, the more we become attuned to cuteness, and the more we want to produce more cuteness. And that throws off in all directions all these objects, cute pictures, cute images. But those are not cute. Those are not the process. Those aren't the process. Those are just like the side effects and the products. Have I said anything at all there?
No, yeah, I think so, because that is very much akin to like the unlimited symbiosis potentially of schizophrenia as process, right? I mean, if you take cute and then immobilize it into a product, it's easy to critique because then it's just a commodity form, right? So
so what is this schizophrenic produced as a clinical entity that Deleuze and Guattari talk about? That's basically, for Qt, that's a Funko Pop, this static, boring thing on a shelf that has to be kept in its box, that no longer conducts the Qt process. It's just something that's been like thrown out the side. And what we're always interested in is giving into the process, how the process can be productive and complexifying. And I think in this respect, you know, there's something interesting to be said about Deleuze and Guattari's model of capitalism and how it maintains an ambivalence. You know, the whole thing is about ambivalence. It's about the fact that capitalism, in a sense, unleashes this thing that's the destruction of all social forms. It's the picking apart, analyzing, reconfiguration of all inherited forms of social being. And at the same time, it's this axiom that reinstantiates things, puts them back into place under a certain set of principles. So it's always ambivalent. And I think that's the power of their model of capitalism. So I think this sophisticated reading of the ambivalence of capitalism and of this process which is continually approaching but never consummating its own limits ultimately goes back to Deleuze's core philosophical position that I was talking about before, namely that novelty or difference emerges out of encounters, and that these encounters are fundamentally configurations of the matter of sensation, right? Because it gives us an ability to think that there is something in capitalism that can produce novelty, adventure, liberation, at the same time as we can understand that it's always clamping down on that. And it's always like putting it back in the box. And cute is kind of the same. Like, yes, it's a cultural force it can be a cultural force that's used for all sorts of means, all sorts of purposes. It can be an opium of the people, but it also has inside it this kind of potential to break apart some of the inherited codes and behaviors. And in particular, I think the kind of rigidity of the masculine subject position that is a kind of a curse on the social sphere. So I think maintaining this ambivalence and understanding this position of like this continual intensification without consummation is extremely important here.
I like that. It's just the way you put it, it puts in light so much of what they talk about with becoming, which you mentioned earlier, right? And so the major mode can never be cute, because it has to be serious, it has to be strong, it has to be imposing a certain sameness and self-identity that radiates outward in order to keep its position. So just as there's no becomings for the major mode for man with a capital M, I suppose man can't be cute, which is one of the critiques. I mean, I know that it comes up a little bit, right? And throughout, because that's another conceptual persona, I guess. Maybe man is the outward form of daddy admin or something.
And the major mode of philosophy also is related to this. Like, the idea that to do philosophy is to somehow master this entire field and work out which philosopher is right, to like pore over every text in order to dismiss or sublate or reach some final conclusion, is something that I think is totally alien to both of us. Like this supposedly serious mode of philosophizing in which you attempt to completely distance yourself from anything that you've actually experienced, or it's not that I want to make philosophy psychobiographical by any means, but I do believe that following these encounters and staying true or staying close to the things that have perturbed you is ultimately the only way to really think. And I think the major mode of philosophy is precisely kind of a mode of administration, it's a mode of admin, of putting things in order. And those people who think that they're able to completely divorce themselves from their own encounters and their psychobiographical experience are usually the ones who are expressing it in the most ridiculous terms in what they do in philosophy.
Also that like being open to encounters is a mode of depersonalization, because it is letting something in that is then determining the trajectory of your thought. Like, you always have to follow the problem wherever it takes you. This is the idea of demonic possession as well. It's not about you dictating where your research is going or what your philosophy is doing. You're like literally clinging on for dear life, figuring this shit out as it's like coming at you from somewhere else.
There was some turn of phrase where you speak about the agency of being a patient. And I guess that makes sense to the voluntary surrender. that is called upon early on.
Yeah, this is in response to the famous critique of accelerationism that Ray Brassier makes about you can't like decide to be impersonal and like ally yourself with the dehumanizing forces of capitalism or whatever.
I think this is an important aspect of our fidelity to what we understand as the original impulse of what has come to be called accelerationism, which is that accelerationism has always involved these temporal paradoxes of agency, which it isn't a matter of simply resolving. Those paradoxes have to be maintained. That's simply what accelerationism is investment in a future which will produce the reason for your investment in it. If you try to collapse or resolve that paradoxical element of accelerationism, all you end up with is either absolute resignation to fate and saying, you know, whatever capitalism does to me, that's fine, and I have no agency, which is what Ray criticizes it for, or you end up with left accelerationism, which is simply kind of leftist administrative politics, which no longer has any element of accelerationism in it at all. So I think that for us is like the core element of accelerationism. And that's exactly what we see in these processes of cuteness, is like desiring investment in processes which are being driven by a future entity
that are only going to be intelligible in retrospect.
Just like for love.
And just like you described the egg, it's after the fact, right? There's a kind of Nachtraglichkeit.
Yeah.
You can look back and say, okay, I was that. I was the egg.
Yeah, I think that's a really, I mean, for me, that was one of the most startling discoveries in writing this book, was thinking about the egg and realizing like, yeah, it's incredible that this mythology has kind of just reemerged. No one knows where it came from, but it's so appropriate to the weird temporal paradoxes of realizing what you were all along. And initiating yourself into what you already were is also a very kind of Nietzschean conception of becoming.
Yeah, where that identity is in the future. So it's not like you're going back to some prior authentic thing that you've discovered was there all along. It's like the thing that you're building through this process that is picking you up from some point that you won't understand until you get there.
Just like falling in love.
I know we could hit a bunch more notes and references. It has been a little over 2 hours. It doesn't feel like it, but it's been a lot of fun. We always give the last word to our guests. And so I guess this is just a chance to talk about anything that you're working on. Potentially, if you're working on things together, if we're going to see a follow-up or a new project.
I don't know if we've thought that far ahead.
No. I mean, look, to add on like the last bit of my origin story, I've failed to do two PhDs. And every time I go into an institution, I realize that I just can't stand it. But I am picking up a project that I started many years ago, which is to do with really the concept of intensity and trying to like think systematically through the history of that concept and the transformations that Deleuze applies to it via the mathematical model indifference and repetition. Because I think, particularly because of Badiou's awful book on Deleuze's relation to mathematics has been vastly underestimated. And I think there's a kind of really fascinating historical aspect to what Deleuze is doing with mathematics that hasn't been appreciated. And so I'm kind of working through that and trying to understand, how the calculus model is not simply a kind of metaphor. I think this is the worst thing you can do with Deleuze, is to think that all of these extraneous non-philosophical sources are simply being hauled in as metaphors for a philosophy that he's already formulated, and he just is trying to communicate by saying, for example, take calculus, for example, take embryology. I don't think that's at all what's happening. I think he has actually a sophisticated understanding of the way in which philosophical problems are historically embedded within movements in the sciences. And so I'm kind of working on that. And I think the second part of that is really an ethics of intensity, is to try and unpack some of the things that Amy and I have developed in Cute Accelerationism to understand, what does it mean to take as a principle of an ethics, this idea of investing in a problem, staying with a problem, allowing the problem to change you. What does it mean to live in intensity? Not in the sense of like, I'm going to go out clubbing every night and have the most intense experience possible, but in the sense of living problems and pursuing problems. So, yeah, those are a couple of things that I'm very slowly working on.
I've been talking about for a while, working on this project, which I'm calling loner feminism. And I think it kind of arises from this frustration with the expectation, typically throughout history, on women to be empathetic, to be caregivers, to be socially engaged, and never being able to be alone. It's fine for a man, like there's this kind of like masculine identity that's actually constructed on this, and especially in like American literature and film. But it's kind of like, that's like a general sort of like, you could leave society, you can be the outsider, you can exit, you can go build your cabin in the forest. This is kind of a socially recognized trope for masculinity. But for women, it's kind of seen as some kind of betrayal of the expectation for feminine labor. So it's kind of like exploring this alternative to participating in these so-called feminine modes of affectivity and empathy, and looking at female figures who leave society or extract themselves from society, and how that leads to a completely different mode of inhabiting subjectivity to the way that masculine identities have constructed this trope. So maybe something closer to female mystics, or like the anchoress tradition, where their subjectivity is about not like kind of reinforcing their uniqueness and their individuality against a world that they don't relate to, but actually dissipating into a like egoless dispersion. For the mystics, in relation to like a love of God or a love of like a nothingness or whatever the subject of that devotion is, and other kind of like, so like I'm trying to construct a philosophical argument around this particular, not very well represented phenomenon.
I mean, it sounds like elements of both your projects are found right in the work, right? I mean, you had those footnotes on the evolution of, was it shoujo and women in demands that in their ways of potentially not participating in reproductive and capitalist production, and also obviously the ethics of intensification. I mean, that already sounds like, part two of Cute, or at least giving more robustness to it.
But with the background of trying to kind of rigorously work out what the history of the concept of intensity is, where it comes from, the different twists and turns that it takes, and what Deleuze does to it. But you're right, like with what's interesting in that history of shoujo manga and to a certain extent the whole kind of kawaii culture is that whereas it can be seen by cultural critics as a kind of way of hiding within a safe little world and like escaping from the depredations of capitalism, in fact it's often operated, cuteness in various ways has operated as a way of marking out a space, in the case of shoujo, for kind of teenage girls, a space of autonomy where the onset of the social roles that have been prepared for them can be held off, where there can be a kind of tactics of resistance, of refusal. And I think that's something we see in all the different cultures of cute that we talk about in the book. And it was really one of the original reasons for wanting to write the book was the feeling that our philosophical outlook communicated with a whole series of cultures which were not to do with building a new world, making everything better, creating a theory of everything, producing another paper on accelerationism, but was to do with people who are actually outcasts or marginals who are producing a space for themselves through these, what seem from the outside rather innocuous, trivial, or superficial practices of cuteness. I think that's one of the things that really is at the center of what we're trying to do, is like, communicate, reach out to these people and to try and build a philosophy that
doesn't tell anyone what to do,
right,
but provides a kind of demonstration of a way to feel like these trivial, ridiculous things, to see how they can be important and how they could actually make knock-on changes that lead to these kind of world-building effects, but from a completely different direction.
And I like the nod to a kind of Bartleby figure in all of these cultures, right? I'd rather not, like.
Yeah, I mean, Bartleby is pretty cute.
I like that as, in opposition to to some sort of heroism that you were talking about earlier with like Nietzsche, like, instead of a heroic self-overcoming, perhaps something a little cuter, a little gentler, a little.
Right. But there's also like the heroism and the kind of macho air of accelerationism itself, which we, as we said, like we found ourselves at odds with at a certain moment, while wanting to retain that kind of core theoretical relationship with what we understood accelerationism to be. Like, you had on one side the kind of neo-reactionary, I'm really tough, I can deal with nature, reality,
yeah.
And on the other side, like this kind of do-gooding, like left accelerationism. We're going to build the world and make it better, and we're going to tell you all what to do and how to do it. And, like somehow escaping from that matrix was very important to us as well, and returning to a different version of accelerationism.
I really enjoyed reading the book, and I can't thank you enough, both of you, for coming and spending your Sunday, part of your Sunday, with us to talk about it. I'm going to read it again, but then I'm going to give it to my wife because she loved the cover. By the way, the cover is adorable. If listeners out there haven't seen it, go look it up and get the book. It is very well priced. I think it's like $21 in US dollars. So grab a copy and thank you again.
Very good value per footnote.
Exactly. Yeah, you got 150 plus footnotes for $21.
Well, thanks for having us.
Very much enjoyed.
Thank you. Thanks for the enthusiasm.
Thanks to you both.
Thanks.
Yeah, keep it cute.
Thanks to Amy and Maya for joining Taylor and I on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour.
The very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without option anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.